Did everyone get the email, or did some of you at least get the email already regarding the survey, the online little survey from Peter Trout? Raise your hands if you did. Okay, those of you that aren't raising your hands, look in your email, make sure you get that survey and complete it. So you're going to be getting an email very shortly about sectioning. We've had almost everyone complete the sectioning requests. Gabe's going to run the algorithm later today, and you'll get emails from your section heads. You can continue to correspond with Gabe about that. Are there any questions from the last few times? It's much more comfortable in this room, so I'm glad we were able to get it. Okay, so last time we discussed the following. We saw the changes that had occurred over the last 100 years in medical care and in the causes of death. Yet we saw that most of the improvements in health seem to precede or be independent of the invention or the promulgation of different sorts of medical treatments and discoveries, however remarkable those discoveries might have been. And we saw this in a number of ways for a number of diseases and in a number of historical junctures. And we also saw that these benefits, these improvements in health, whatever their source, did not accrue evenly to all people, and that there were widening differentials in health status across social class, race, and so forth, including in the recent past. And this tension between the treatment of individuals and the prevention of illness in populations persists. Now, there are different ways that you can think about measuring socioeconomic status, and I'm going to use this concept very loosely today, though we will focus on specifics, but I'm going to kind of move from one measure to another. They could include things like money, education, occupation, or status, some kind of measure of status. Education offers the advantage that it is accessible, at least in theory, to everyone, to men and to women, and that it is fixed relatively early in life, and so it suffers less from the so-called reverse causation problem that we'll be hearing about in just a moment. So education, comes first and other stuff happens later. You don't have to worry about what the causal order is. Is it health that causes wealth? Is it wealth that causes health? Or is it health that causes education? Is it education that causes health? Education usually precedes health, and so we can kind of get that straight in our minds. And status can include things like being a descendant of the passengers on the Mayflower, or if you're in Australia, the first fleeter being transported in the first fleet in Australia, or a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad, or being an aristocrat, or being a user of Apple Macs, or being in the Quad, or just, having charisma. Those are all measures potentially of status. Now, if you're poor or less educated or unfortunately rivered, you're more likely to die. And there's a very convincing gradient across a number of these metrics. So, for example, this shows age-adjusted death rates in 25 to 64-year-olds according to education, income, race, and sex. So here we have whites and blacks, men and women, and here we have different amount of years of schooling completed. So, for example, if you only had a primary or high school education, your death rate was 7.6 if you're a white man. Gets better if you complete high school. Not much better, in fact, it doesn't change, at least measurably here empirically, if you don't complete college, but then if you get a college education, it's still better. And there's a monotonic decrease in mortality for white men according to education. Similarly, for white women, of course, white women have a lower force of mortality because women are less likely to die than men at all ages, and it monotonically declines. Black women, same kind of thing. Black men, it doesn't monotonically decline. For some reason, completing a college education in black men increases their risk of death, at least in this data. I have no idea why that might be. But when you study the real world, sometimes it's messy. Not everything falls out according to what you think. And similar gradients can also be observed with income here in these little buckets that are shown on this slide. So there's considerable patterning in the risk of death. And even finishing college, it seems, might yield a return, just every incremental across the whole spectrum, like moving from high school completion to some college to college and so forth. At every step, you get some bang for your buck. Now, this table shows something similar here in terms of risk for cardiovascular disease. So here we have age-adjusted death rates from heart disease in the same age group according to income, race, and sex. Here we have men and women again, white and black. And here now we have income. And if you compare, for instance, black men to white men, in this income group, very poor group, black men have an excess mortality. They're 21% more likely to die, have greater odds of death. That risk equalizes when you get to higher incomes. So if you, at higher wealth, rich black men have the same risk of death as rich white men. And what's interesting to me, and then similarly for women, you can do the same kind of calculations. It doesn't seem to level off for women in this particular case. And you can also compare the ratio of the highest to lowest income. So these ratios compare blacks versus whites, compare by race, and these ratios compare by income. So it would compare this number to this number, for example. And you can see, comparing the richest to the poorest in these data, the poorest have more than twice the risk of death compared to the richest in this category, in this categorization. And what's interesting to me about this is we often spend so much time in our society obsessed with race differences in mortality. And there are differences, as we have seen and we'll see, but actually the class differences are even bigger, right? The differences, if you compare the richest to the poorest, are much bigger than the differences if you compare blacks to whites, even though the latter typically get much more attention. This in part reflects a kind of aversion in our society to thinking about class, right? We have the kind of myth in our society that anyone can lift themselves up by the bootstraps, and we are in fact one of the most economically mobile societies on the planet, but nevertheless we are highly stratified actually by income. And in ways I'll come back to later in the class when we talk about income inequality, in some ways that dispersion has been increasing. Now usually the direction of causation here is taken to be from socioeconomic status to health. And so the idea is that there's something about your socioeconomic status, your education, your wealth, your status and so forth, your occupation, that is then seen as being causally prior to and causing your health status or increasing or decreasing your risk of death. And this is hypothesized to occur in a variety of ways. What might be some of those ways? How could it be that SES causes health? I'm sorry, say that again? Access to quality health care. Okay, so far though, we've been building a case in the class that might not be such a big deal, right? You're still clinging to that belief. I'm going to extirpate it from you by the end of the semester. Largely extirpate, not completely. But yes, there could be the sense in which people of higher status have access to better health care. And this may matter in some parts of the world more than others. So in the developing world, for instance, giving women an education can have a big impact on their health and their kids' health, whereas in our society, perhaps less so. Yes? Proper nutrition, very good. Yeah. Better lifestyle, elaborate a little bit. What can you afford? And leisure, you assume exercise. So what's interesting about the modern period of time is we see exercise as a luxury good right now. But if you go back 50 or 100 years, the working class people actually were engaged in physical activity a lot more. The exercise was part of their job. Whereas now we see that rich people, and rich people, there's like Daddy Warbucks, these fat rich people. Now it's sort of the opposite. We kind of see obesity affecting lower class people more, and we think of free time to engage in exercise as a kind of leisure good. Yeah, other ideas. Yeah.
People with higher education and higher socioeconomic status are more likely to comply with very regimented routines, especially when they have disease, age, or diabetes.
Okay. So this goes back to the idea we talked about the use of knowledge 1 or 2 lectures ago. So if you have higher SES, maybe you can deploy knowledge in ways that enhance your health in other ways. And you guys are coming up with all the standard and correct explanations, with a little asterisk about the medical care one, which we'll come back to. So they include things like, notice I did put it up here, though. I don't want to pick on you, okay? At the bottom of the list here. So nutrition and sanitation, material comfort, different kinds of risk behaviors, and access to and use of health care. These are all possible mechanisms for the effect of socioeconomic status on health. And these factors are no doubt important to varying degrees, but they do not explain all of the relationship. For example, as we've already begun to see, when it comes to the issue of health care, at least at the population level, it's not necessarily the case that more health care is the key to more health. Nevertheless, in terms of risk behaviors, here is the age-adjusted prevalence of current cigarette smoking, to pick an example, in the year 2000 among people 25 years of age and older, according to education level. And so here is the probability or current cigarette smoking, the fraction of people smoking, according to whether you didn't finish high school, you finished high school, you had some college, or your bachelor's degree or higher, and it monotonically declines. The more educated you are, the less likely you are to smoke. And in fact, college-educated people are about a third as likely to smoke as people who did not go to college, and smoking is in fact very deadly. Or, taken from your readings, I think, this is from your readings, here are the educational differences in the extent to which people use medical care correctly. So it is important, depending on their education. Specifically now we're looking at people with diabetes. And this slide taken from your readings shows the variation in various personal behaviors among diabetic patients enrolled in a very famous large randomized controlled trial called the Diabetes Control and Complication Trial, or the DCCT. So here are different kinds. So in the control group, in the people that were in the trial, we're trying to see, okay, do they behave in certain ways, and how does it correspond to the amount of education they had? More is on the left, less education is on the right. So the number of times they monitor their blood glucose per week, you should be doing that more. That's a better thing if you have diabetes. It's more common in more educated people and less common in less educated people. Missing insulin injections is bad. That's less common if you're more educated. Do not follow the insulin regimen. Do not self-test. Minutes of very hard exercise, which is a good thing, and currently smoking, which is a bad thing. All of these things are patterned in exactly the sorts of ways that you would expect. And in fact, this study, this DCCT study, was a large randomized prospective trial that was examining the effectiveness of intensive diabetes treatment. So the question was, did it matter? All this years, decades of ideology that getting diabetics to strictly manage their blood sugar, did that actually help them? Did it make a difference in their survival or in their long-term outcomes? So actually a large trial finally was done a few years ago to test this claim that strict management was beneficial. And between 1983 and 1989, 1,441 patients between the ages of 13 and 39 were enrolled, and they were randomized to receive either an intensive or conventional therapy approach, and they were followed until 1993, so at least for 4 years, and in some cases for 10 years. Now, one way to measure diabetic severity is to look at something known as the hemoglobin A1C level. The hemoglobin A1C level is the way to think about it is there's sort of sugar floating around in your blood, and your red blood cells, which most of you know look like donuts or so-called biconcave discs, those little red blood cells, the sugar that's floating around kind of sticks to the red blood cells. And it's much better, rather than taking a pinprick and measuring your instantaneous blood sugar in your blood today or this moment, it's much better to get a kind of integrated measure across time. And the sugar coating on these donuts, these red cell donuts, that's a much better measure integrated across time, the extent to which your red blood cells have been exposed to too much sugar, as it were, in your bloodstream. That's a much better measure than these instantaneous amounts. So Goldman and Smith, in your readings, hypothesized that imposing the intensive regimen in the arm of the study where people were randomly assigned to really intensely take charge, listen to the doctors, and take care of their diabetes, they hypothesized that imposing the intensive regimen would have a bigger impact on the less educated participants because they otherwise had poor self-maintenance in normal circumstances. So it's the idea that a less educated person, if forced to obey the regimen, would then derive more benefit than an average educated person who otherwise would naturally adopt this regimen for some of the reasons that you guys were alluding to. So this is actually a very stringent test of their hypothesis. And you kind of, because you're kind of forcing the people at the lower end of the spectrum, the uneducated, to do the right thing. And it's a test, yet again, of this claim about structure versus agency. What's more important in this case? Is it the volition, the desire of the individuals to treat their diabetes, or is it something about the external structure that's imposed that, regardless of the person's agency, can achieve the desired objective? Interfering with a guy before he jumps off the bridge, like we talked about at the first lecture, maybe that's going to prevent him from killing himself. So what this shows then, the conventional group and the intensive treatment group, and this is their blood glucose, their glycosylated hemoglobin level at baseline at the end of the study. And for example, in those with a postgraduate degree, even amongst the control arm of the study, there was some increase in the glycosylated hemoglobin, so they did worse. But in the treatment arm of the study, they did better. The glycosylated hemoglobin declined, and the difference from the beginning to the end was 0.85. And you have to do a difference in differences measure here. You have to compare this number to this number. This is what otherwise would have happened. There would have been an increase. Now with the treatment, there's a slight decrease. The difference between those two numbers is minus 1.31. That's the impact of the randomization to intensive treatment among the people who were treated. Okay? But now look at this gradient here at the bottom according to whether you had more or less of education. Among the people who lacked a high school education, they had the biggest impact, almost twice as much impact in benefit from this intensive regimen. So the less educated people who were randomly assigned to intense or non-intensive treatment, they got more bang for the buck. But that's a situation in which you have like a highly expensive, intense approach to persuading people at the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum, let's say, to do something that would benefit their health. Let's think about something else that was covered in your readings. So how many of you sleep on your backs? And how many of you sleep, lying flat on your stomach or some variant? And how many on your sides? So most of us on the sides. I sleep on my, I'm in the, what position am I in? I think I'm in free fall or something. I don't understand, what kind of a loser would sleep in starfish position? Like, how is that? It's so comfortable, someone says, yes. And trunk, I mean, if you're going to lie on your side, at least do the fetal position. Like, I don't understand the trunk position. So people sleep in different positions. And there's not been, there are a number of sort of pop, like if you Google this, and please don't Google this right now, out of respect to your neighbors, if not to me, but there's like a number of pop psychology studies that have been done on how your sleeping position is associated with all kinds of things. I'll leave it to your imagination what they surmise that it could be associated with. And there's not a lot of scientific study on sleep position in adults that I'm aware of. If you find something, please send it to me. I'll add it to the lectures in the future. But one Canadian survey found that 39% of respondents preferred a kind of, so one study found so people have studied like people reporting different fractions sleeping in these positions, and they fall around this sort of distributions that you guys reported. But what if you, compared to the DCCT trial, what if you don't force people to do the right thing? What if you just offer a free, easy, life-saving intervention, as described in your readings for today, like the Back to Sleep campaign? So here's an idea where we just have a kind of a mass media outreach campaign to people and say, look, if you put your baby to sleep face down, they're at risk for sudden infant death syndrome. Okay, that's bad for your baby. Sleeping, if you're an adult, fine, go ahead, sleep face down. But if you're a baby, don't do that. And as most of you, I hope, know, little babies, they can't flip over, right? I mean, you put them in a position and they don't move. Actually, when they start to move, that's when parenting becomes hard. At the beginning, you just put them somewhere and you go away and you come back and they're still there. They haven't moved. When they get older, it's harder. But at the beginning, you put them on their back or on their belly and they don't move from that position, okay? But so the argument is don't put them on their belly because they can suffocate when they're on their belly. So instead, put them to sleep on their backs in the so-called Back to Sleep campaign. So it's a big campaign, and it's described in your readings. And it looked at SIDS cases per 1,000 before and after the Back to Sleep campaign, according to the levels of education. So here, if you look at whites in 1989 to 1991, here are the white rates of death for Back to Sleep. Here are the, among the whites, here are the rates among the relatively uneducated people, elementary school or some high school, compared to the rates amongst those with college graduates. And there's 5 times higher amongst whites. Amongst whites, the rates of SIDS death is 5 times higher comparing the uneducated to the educated before the intervention. Then the intervention is implemented. Everyone's rates go down. Everyone benefits some from the campaign to go back to sleep, okay? So you can compare this little point to that point, for example. It moves down, and this point to this point, it moves down. But the educated get much more benefit, okay? So the ratio of the educated to the uneducated afterwards is 7 times, Okay, a factor of 7. So the educated are 7 times less likely to die, have their children die of SIDS after the campaign, and 5 times more likely before the campaign. So the gaps widen yet again after the dissemination of this thing. This free, cheap, both are the same words, cheap and free. So this cheap, easy intervention, which is widely broadcast to be of use to people, is implemented more rapidly and more effectively by the educated than by the uneducated. And notice that in blacks, the rates are higher in all periods. So here are blacks before and after, and if you compare them to whites, and amongst Hispanics are better in all periods. This is a little footnote that I want to just flag for you. We'll come back to it, because Hispanics evince something known as the Hispanic paradox, whereby many health measures among Hispanics are better than you would expect based on their socioeconomic status, for reasons we'll discuss again. So there's a death gradient here, both by education within every racial category. And note that there are lower SIDS death rates in the later time periods, so the campaign clearly worked, but there were widening differentials. The introduction of an inexpensive, easy public health intervention has not reduced social inequalities. In fact, the gap has widened. And though the risk of SIDS has been reduced in all social class groups, women who are more educated have experienced the greatest relative decline. Now, is that clear? Because there were some quizzical looks. So it gets better for everybody, but it gets even better, relatively speaking, for the educated than for the relatively uneducated after the intervention. Now, there are 2 possible, not mutually exclusive explanations for this phenomenon. Either the information about infant sleep position is not being disseminated as fully to women in low social class groups. So maybe the campaign is in locations and via media that don't reach the vulnerable groups. Or women in low social class groups are receiving appropriate advice but not heeding it. And that difference is yet again the difference between structure and agency. Okay? In one case, there are structural factors which interfere with people getting the information that would benefit them. And in the other, they get the information, but they choose not to deploy the information. Hard for us to imagine why that might be, why you wouldn't, having received this information, let's say, and understood it, not start putting your baby to sleep on the back rather than on your tummy, but that's, your choice, as it were. Now, it's important to realize that the relationship between socioeconomic status and health could actually run the opposite way. And this is an issue known as reverse causation in the social sciences, or also known as endogeneity. So the two phenomena are endogenous to each other. They're like kind of co-determined or intermingled with each other. And more generally, when one observes associations in the world, when you go out and look at observational data and you see stuff, especially in social phenomena, it does not necessarily imply cause, though it often does. And in fact, when it comes to wealth, there isn't just a correlation across individuals whereby healthy people are richer. There is an association across time within individuals wherein healthy people become richer. And that is, better health is associated with greater wealth, and it also with greater increases in wealth in the future. And these are data taken from your readings. So the question here is, well, now can we reverse the causal order and ask the question, does health cause wealth, not does wealth cause health? So let's take a sample of people, look at their health status. Is it excellent, very good, good, or poor in 1984? Look at how much household wealth they have, and then let's see what happens to their household wealth. And people in excellent health increase the amount of money that they have, and people in poor health decrease the amount of money they have. Sort of suggesting that there's something about your health status which could be causing your health status which could be causing your wealth, and not just your wealth which could be causing your health. So these data suggest the possibility of both directions of causation. Wealth could grow more rapidly among those who started in better health because good health enhances future earning capacity and facilitates savings. So how else do you think could health affect wealth? What are some other mechanisms? Yeah. So you don't need to spend money on what? Yeah, okay, good. Right, so one idea is that you're burning your money on health care, and so that's one of the reasons being unhealthy makes you poorer. Okay, very good. Other ideas? Yeah?
Being healthy ostensibly means that, you can do your job better, especially if you work in a
Okay, so the idea here is very good, is that being healthy increases your earning potential. So you can earn more money when you're healthier compared to when you're unhealthy. Other ideas? Yeah, way in the back.
Poor uninsured people won't get care when they are sick, and that leads to diseases that are even worse than they could have.
So there's some sense in which if you're sick already and poor, you make choices that worsen your health even more than they otherwise would. Okay, also a good idea. And in fact, all of these are possibilities. There can be possible mechanisms of the effect of health on SES. If you're born with a problem of some kind, this might reduce your educational prospects. For example, if you're born blind people on average may have less educational attainment than non-blind people, for instance. Or if you're born with diabetes or some other condition that might interfere with your, or asthma that might interfere with your early education, this could cause a problem. You could spend down your savings, as someone mentioned, and as someone else mentioned, you could have a loss of earnings or work. So first of all, poor health could result in limitations of opportunities for education or training. Those that are uncoordinated, blind, diabetic, mentally ill, and so on may receive lesser educational opportunities or have fewer opportunities both early and later in life. But it can also affect wealth. Health can also affect wealth in other ways as well. Here, taken from your data, is what happens in a sample of adults in their 50s when there's a major illness such as cancer or stroke. And this slide shows various changes between waves 1 and wave 3 of the data set, the health and retirement survey that was used by these people. It's a sample of 22,000 individuals in their 50s over an interval of 4 years. So they looked at, okay, what happens to people, the economic effects of a major illness 4 years later if you have a stroke or cancer. So your total medical expenses could be $28,000, your out-of-pocket expenses could be about $2,000, and your net wealth could decline by about $16,000. So new episodes of poor health lead to lower wealth accumulation, but it's still unclear why. And it turns out it's not, as the study shows, not just the actual expenses, but as someone else pointed out, the decreased ability to work. So one of the reasons that health causes wealth is if you're sick, you can't earn as much money. So of course, as most of you have probably been anticipating, the relationship between SES and health goes both ways. And it also depends a bit on what SES measure we're using and what health measure and what stage of life and what time horizon. It's a complicated relationship, a complicated phenomenon. And it's important, regardless, to exclude another problem of inference known as confounding. So for example, I might suggest to you that there is, and this is known as third factor confounding, I might suggest to you that that TV viewing can cause heart attacks. We go out into the world and we see that people who watch a lot of television or spend a lot of time on Facebook, especially in class, are more likely to have a heart attack, God willing. And you know, I might say, well, maybe the mechanism of this effect is that the TV is, you know, emitting some kind of wave, and the wave like penetrates your chest, and it like goes into your coronary arteries, and that little wave, you know, causes your coronary arteries to squeeze down and have a heart attack. I mean, that doesn't seem very credible, right? It doesn't seem like that's the mechanism by which TV viewing could be causing you to have a heart attack. Much more likely is that there's some other third factor, like having a sedentary lifestyle, not exercising very much, that causes both the television viewing and the heart attack. So when you think that it's TV viewing causing a heart attack, it's actually not. That's a false conclusion that you've wrongly drawn from observing the world. Actually, there's some other thing you hadn't perhaps thought of or measured or observed, such as the extent to which these people live a sedentary lifestyle, and that third thing is causing both phenomena, which then artificially seem correlated, but actually one of them is not causing the other. So this is a general problem when you think about sort of social phenomena, especially using observational data, as we often will, although we'll also show you some experiments later in the class. And specifically here in this case, it might be that there, let's say, could be some kind of personality trait. You know, maybe people who are very, you know, type A are more likely to earn more money over the course of their lives and more likely to be healthier over the course of their lives. So in fact, it could be the case that it's not true that socioeconomic status causes health, or even that health causes socioeconomic status. It could be that there's some other third factor that simultaneously causes both. Now, in an ideal situation, we would somehow be able to do experiments to test this, randomly assigning people to different socioeconomic statuses to see what health implications they had, or randomly assigning people to different health statuses, taking people and harming their health in some way, and then seeing what happens, or elevating their health in some way, and seeing what happens to their socioeconomic status afterwards. But since it's unlikely that we could do this artificially, perhaps we could find some kind of a natural experiment, some kind of experiment that just happened to take place naturally, not artificially. For example, remember the doctor's strike that we discussed earlier in the class, which would be a natural experiment regarding the impact of healthcare or the withdrawal of healthcare. If we want to make the claim that healthcare causes health, we'd love to do an experiment where we could randomly assign groups or people not to get healthcare and then see what happens to their health. We really can't do that kind of an experiment, but maybe we could just wait for a natural experiment where doctors happen to go on strike and then see what happens. Can you think of any natural experiments that could test the SES health relationship? Yeah. Immigration, okay, is that, tell me two more sentences. What would that be like? Okay, so actually I should probably go back. So I don't want you focused so much on the issue of third factor confounding. I want you to tell me more about, can you think of an experiment that would allow you to test this claim? Forget about the third factor thing right now. Some kind of natural experiment where people would be randomly assigned to socioeconomic status. The immigration story might not necessarily be a good one because people aren't randomly assigned to immigration, right? Maybe the more talented people or the more physically fit people can literally make it across the border from Mexico. So only the healthiest people make it across the border. And in fact, maybe that's one of the reasons for the Hispanic paradox. We'll come back to that. So that might not work, yeah? But did you want to have more to say about that? No? Is that enough? Yeah? Excellent. So lottery winners might be a natural experiment. In fact, we will look at lottery winners in 1 minute. Other ideas of natural experiments? Yeah? Excellent. Yeah, genetic disease. Genetics is a little tricky because genes can be pleiotropic. Raise your hands if you know what pleiotropic means. Okay, so that means when a gene can have multiple effects. So maybe the same gene that gives you the illness gives you other, let's say, adverse consequences like some cognitive deficits or something like that. So then you can't be sure that it's the illness that's causing it. But you could look at other kinds of things like, planes falling from the air or being hit by a bus, for example, or some other kinds of catastrophic events that, you don't have any control over, let's say. Other ideas? So let's look at the lottery example that someone mentioned. So here's longitudinal data regarding a random sample of Britons who received medium-sized lottery wins of between 1,000 and 120,000 pounds, which is up to about $200,000. And I think this is on the left-hand side. When compared to two control groups, those who didn't have any winnings and those who had small winnings, individuals who had bigger winnings eventually go on to exhibit significantly better psychological health. So they're measuring mental well-being here on something called the GHQ scale. I forgot what that stands for, GHQ. It stands for, I don't know, something health quality or something. I'm not sure. But anyway, it's some measure of mental health. And here are the people who didn't win. Here are the people who had a small win. And here are the people who had a big win. And they look at their GHQ stress according to the amount of lottery win across time. And the winners went on to have better mental health than the people who didn't win. So this would be like randomly assigning people some wealth and seeing whether there's an association. If I go into the world and observe depressed people have less money, I don't know, is it that they were depressed and they got less money, or are they depressed because they had less money? Wouldn't it be great if I could randomly assign all of you to have $1 million and all of you not, and then I come back in a year and see who's happier and who's not, and you guys are happier, then I've done a nice experiment and I've made my case. And the other paper on the right-hand side also studies the effect of income on health and mortality using lottery prizes. This is a study in Sweden, and the findings are that higher income causally generates good health, and that this effect is of similar magnitude as when traditional estimation techniques using observational data are used. They found that a 10% income increase due to a lottery winning improves health by about 4 to 5% of a standard deviation. So if you won about 100,000 Swedish kroners on lotteries, this increases your general health by 3% of a standard deviation at the end of the period, and decreases your probability of dying within 5 or 10 years by 2 to 3 percentage points. So people who won mid-sized lotteries in Sweden have less likely to die and have better measures. So here are all the dependent variables that they look at, and they look at if they have an average lottery prize, and they look at all kinds of things, whether you're more likely to have a headache, or be overweight, or be dead, and so forth. And they find, generally speaking, improvements in all of these measures. So a natural experiment. Yeah? Yeah, your point is excellent, but conditional on participation. This is conditional on participation. So everyone buys it. We look at people who buy a ticket, and you're right, rich people are less likely to buy tickets than poor people, but conditional on participating, we find that those who win, which is random, which is exogenous, do better than not. You could look at what you're talking about is subtle and important, would be treatment heterogeneity. So now the question would become, maybe lottery winnings are especially likely have an effect. Winning the money is, those who win money do better than those who don't, but those who win money who are poor do a lot better than those who win money who are rich. So we could do a sub-analysis, and that might in fact be the case. But the overall treatment effect is as described here by these studies, conditional on participating on the lottery. It wouldn't be fair to compare lottery non-winners or lottery winners to lottery non-participants, right? Because they're a different kind of people. They don't even play the lottery. Maybe they're super healthy, for example, and that's why they don't play the lottery. And so that wouldn't be that wouldn't really be an experiment. Yeah, in the back there. No, you're rubbing your face. Okay, yeah. I can't see. Yeah. That's a great question. How do we know whether it's the actual capital or whether it's the sense of, I'm great, I won the lottery, God loves me, I'm an important person, right? Yeah, that's a good question. We'll come back to that, actually. We'll come back explicitly to that point in a few lectures. And I remember when I was at the University of Chicago, my kids were very small. They were, I don't know, anyway, it doesn't matter. Sebastian and Lysander were little boys, and we went to the children's, there's like a children's museum on a wharf in Chicago, and by dumb luck, the day we went there was a kind of reunion of Illinois state lottery winners. And there were all these people walking around who had no connection to each other. I mean, it was like a weird party. And they all had name tags, hi, I'm Susie, and underneath it had how much money they won. And I've never seen a more depressed group of people in my entire life. And they were all depressed, even the ones that had 20 million winnings, especially the ones that had $500,000 winnings. They were like, damn, I didn't win very much. So, and there's an interesting kind of pop literature on how after you win the lottery, people are less happy, not more happy. But these more academic studies suggest that on average, at least for mid-scale prizes, it may be the case that there's something actually really devastating about winning $100 million. Although it's hard for me to conceive of what that would be. But anyway, the academic studies show that in general, it's a good thing, at least for your health, to win the lottery. So the nature of the interrelationship of health and socioeconomic status, and in particular income, which is what we've been discussing in the last 10 minutes, could indeed, now as a further wrinkle, let me introduce another idea, be life stage specific, okay? So it might not just be that it's two-way causation and third factor confounding and all the other complexities that I've been telling you about. There could be still another complexity, which is it could depend on where in the life course the people are. So it might be that early in life, the relationship goes from SES to health. So people born into a poor family, for example, or are having other issues, that's what causes them to have ill health. But later in life, it could be that the relationship primarily goes from health to SES. And in fact, we've seen evidence for both of those claims so far today. The HRS data is more from the right-hand side of the picture, and some of the other data we saw is more from the left-hand side of the picture, the slides towards the beginning of the talk today. Now, since the factors that we considered earlier, we mentioned earlier today, behaviors, nutrition, access to healthcare, and so forth, appear to account for only a portion of the putative effect of SES on health, people have begun to take a closer look at a variety of other intriguing explanations, including the one that you just suggested. So here are a couple of ideas. We'll return to these ideas later in the course. One idea is that one of the mechanisms by which SES affects health has something to do with social hierarchy. It's not having more education or having more money that matters. It's being the top dog that matters, like having that sense that you're on the top that might be beneficial or might be the mechanism by which SES causes health. And the second possibility, or second interesting set of ideas, has to do with something known as childhood exposures and marking. And here the idea is that there's something about early life exposures that change your body, that become literally embodied within you in ways that we will return to also later in the class. Now, and I'll just briefly introduce these ideas now. The focus on the role of hierarchy stresses both the relative position in society and also position in your immediate social networks. So the argument here is that it's not your absolute standing in terms of your education or wealth that matters, it's your relative standing. Are you higher up than the people you know or than the people in your society? And part of the motivation for thinking this is that the relationship between education and income and health seems to have persisted forever. I mean, ancient Romans who were rich lived longer than ancient Romans who were poor. Even though rich ancient Romans had nowhere near the kind of luxuries that the poor person would have today. And this has persisted even in the United States over the last 10, 20, 100 years. Even though the United States has been getting richer and richer for everybody, there's still a relationship between how educated you are or how rich you are and how healthy you are. The second example here is something known as the Barker hypothesis. And the Barker hypothesis states that nutritional or other deprivation in utero may lead to preferential blood flow to critical organs and the deprivation of other body parts, setting up problems later in life with metabolism, the coagulation system, and the cardiovascular system. So the idea here is that if you're in utero and your mother is nutritionally or otherwise deprived, let's say she's stressed, blood is preferentially routed to your brains, and other parts of your body, like your gastrointestinal system, don't mature or develop normally. And these conditions, in fact, could place you at risk later in life for diabetes or cardiovascular disease and so forth. So you have the same genetic constitution you otherwise would, but because you had this early in utero exposure, your body reshapes itself to cope with it, and you carry those marks with you for the rest of your life, as it were. And similar work has been done using things like exogenous famines, for example. There's a very famous case, which we may or may not go into, of a famine in Amsterdam during World War II, looking at what happened to babies who were born after the famine had already stopped. How were they affected by being exposed to famine while they were still in utero? So regarding the Barker hypothesis, here's just some initial data. These are data from nearly 3,000 Finnish babies born at the Helsinki University Central Hospital between 1924 and 1933. And the table shows something known as standardized mortality ratios for coronary heart disease, or standardized mortality ratio, SMR, on the right hand there, according to the ponderal index. And the SMR is the number of observed deaths divided by the number of expected deaths. And in this case, it's the number of deaths that would have been expected based on the whole sample and the numbers in each row. And so what we're asking is we look at the babies, how ponderal, how big they are in terms of kilograms per meter squared, and look at their likelihood of dying in the future. And so bigger babies have a lower risk of death, and smaller babies have a bigger risk of death in the future. So if you're starved in utero, you carry with you this for life, even if you survive the neonatal period. And there's a strong trend in coronary heart disease, something that strikes you decades later. The babies aren't born and have heart attacks in the first few years of their life. They're having these heart attacks when they're 50s and 60s, and they're having it in part because when they were in their mother's uteruses, they didn't get as much nutrition as they needed. Men who were thin at birth had death rates that were twice those of men who had a high ponderal index. And this data suggests that restricted growth in utero is associated with an increased risk of coronary heart disease. So if your mother endured a famine or was malnourished while she was pregnant with you, you will be marked through no fault of your own, through no agency of your own. Moreover, other work by this research group has shown that men who grow slowly in utero for non-genetic reasons or non-biological reasons, not having to do necessarily with the mother, remain biologically different compared to other men. They are more vulnerable to the effects of low socioeconomic status and low income or coronary heart disease. So they have the double whammy. When you're born small, you're even less able to cope with being poor than when you're born big. So you have both things that can combine to create a kind of perfect storm that affects your health. Conversely, men who are not thin at birth were more resilient to the later effects of poor living standards at subsequent points in their lives. And of course, the Barker hypothesis, as I've just mentioned, only kicks in if you actually survive your infancy. You could, of course, just die to begin with. You could be so sickly that you die right off. And these are rates of neonatal deaths per 1,000 births according to maternal race and education in the United States in 1998. So here, if you look at non-Hispanic whites, they have these death rates here, and blacks, non-Hispanic blacks, have higher rates. And within each racial group, you see a gradient according to education. So those with 16 or more years of education have lower rates, so there's a trend within each one. But there's still a race difference. Here, Hispanics, who do better than blacks and than whites, have lower rates of neonatal mortality. Here, American Indians, and here, Asian or Pacific Islanders. And all of these groups have the education gradient and the race gradient. So socioeconomic status matters. It precedes health in many ways that we have been seeing. And social hierarchy is also an important variable, and ideas about it relate to your relative standing versus your absolute standing, suggesting that your position in society itself could confer risks. This is an idea we'll treat like almost in a whole lecture in 5 or 10 lectures from now, but just to give you a feel for it, this data shows some data from the Whitehall study, and it looks at British civil servants. So these are wealthy Britons. They have jobs, they're employed, they're working in a safe industry, they're not miners, they're civil servants working in Whitehall. And we look at their mortality rates, or their relative rate of death from cardiovascular disease, according to the kind of job, the classification of job that they have. Now, administrative here does not mean like administrative assistant or secretary. Here it means like they're CEOs or they're like managers. And the managers have the lowest rate compared to professional or other executive, compared to clerical, compared to all others. So even amongst this very privileged group of people who have jobs, who are in England, who have access to the National Health Service and so forth, hierarchy in the workplace, at least observationally, seems to be associated with the risk of death from cardiovascular disease. And these relative rates of death here in these data were adjusted for age, smoking, systolic blood pressure, cholesterol, and a host of other things. So it's not that the people at the lower end of the hierarchy were more likely to be smokers or older, have something else wrong with them. All of that's been taken into account in the graph that's shown you here. And we'll return to this at the end of the course. So you could actually sketch out a whole life course model regarding how different aspects of SES affected different aspects of physiology at different stages in a person's life. You could get very baroque about this if you really wanted to. So socioeconomic position, as we've seen, can affect intrauterine conditions, which affect your birth, can give you low birth weight or growth retardation, which can contribute, as we saw, to atherosclerosis later in life. It can affect education and environmental conditions you have in your childhood, which might affect your probability of smoking or diet or exercise, which can give you atherosclerosis, or your working conditions in adulthood, which can contribute to job stress, which could give you CVD, coronary vascular disease, or later in life, your income and assets in old age, and could affect your adequacy of your medical care and reduce your function. And all of these things could happen in all kinds of complex ways. And I also want to close with a couple of remarks by saying, first of all, that not all disparities are the same, either in magnitude or importance. So just because I've listed all these things doesn't mean they have equal effects. Some of them are much more important than others of them. And some of them seem more unfair than others. So disparities that arise due to race or due to circumstances of birth often seem more unfair, at least in our society, than those that arise due to disparities in income. And disparities arising at birth seem very unfair. It seems like every baby born should have an equal chance at a healthy life. We cannot change, and here's a new idea that I'll be introducing, we cannot change the natural lottery of genetic endowments and biological circumstances at birth, though we can compensate for it, but we can try to fix the social lottery. So there are two kinds of things that affect your life circumstances. There's the natural lottery that assigns you genetic and biological endowments at birth, and the social lottery that determines into which kind of household you're born. There's really not very much we can do about the former, but there's a lot that we can do about the latter. Plus, as Smith points out, it may be much more effective in terms of policy and money to address the problems early rather than late. And the return on investment may be much higher than the billions we spend on Medicare, as we saw 2 lectures ago. So to close, socioeconomic status is a fundamental cause of disease, as the very important Lincoln Phelan article argued. Socioeconomic status, so the fundamental cause of disease idea, states that associations of SES and health, the association of SES and health has persisted Despite changes of intervening mechanisms, wholesale elimination of risks, changes in causes of death, and increases in life expectancy, the relationship is fundamental. We still see this relationship even after all the inventions of the last century. Fundamental causes are about access to material and non-material resources, and such access is always differentially distributed, and so will be differentially accessible to produce utility. And the notion of fundamental causes also relies on the existence of change in the biological and social world. It's because of change that socioeconomic status can remain a fundamental cause. Because fundamental causes involve access to resources, they influence multiple risk factors and have multiple outcomes. Consequently, the relationship between a fundamental cause and illness can be preserved through changes either in the mechanisms or in the outcomes being considered. And this is a key idea we're going to continue to explore. See you later.